help women, save lives, and peacefully end abortion where you live.
I can tell you exactly what would happen. The infant would be delivered. The infant would be kept comfortable. The infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired.
You were serious about that?
Be inspired to change hearts and minds by joining over 1 million volunteers taking part in the global movement happening in your neighborhood.
She says, pray that I can get through this abortion. And I said, oh, no. So she went ahead and went into the abortion clinic. And she just came out. She told us, I'm not going to get the abortion. We just had a baby saved. We had a baby saved in Memphis today. Praise the Lord.
This is the 40 Days for Life podcast with your host, Shawn Carney.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today on the 40 Days for Life podcast. I'm Shawn Carney, the president of 40 Days for Life, and your host for this podcast, which is dedicated to helping you end abortion where you live. We are glad that you are here. We are going to discuss why and how hating Jews is now acceptable again. And over the last few weeks, as we've talked about Israel and Hamas and the reaction in the culture war here in America, where supporting Hamas is totally fine. Having people go to major U.S. cities and scream death to Jews and do like they did in New York, where they marched to the Israeli embassy, and all of this is somehow a sophisticated point of view. So I have been asking the questions, did we learn anything from Germany in the 1930s? And the very sad answer is not a lot, or altogether no, or we just no longer care. So in this podcast, we will remind you and ourselves of the 1930s and indeed the Holocaust, where we will talk about my trip to Auschwitz when I went. We had our 40 Days for Life leader training. We had our African leaders and our European leaders in Poland in February. We went to Poland in February because it was very cheap to have a training in Poland in February, and it was cold for sure. But the highlight was the extremely moving, extremely powerful 5-hour tour of the notorious Auschwitz concentration camp. And so I'll give you a little glimpse of that. We're not going to dwell on it for the entire podcast, so I don't want you, turning this off or being like, I don't know if I can do this. We're going to tie it into what's going on today. But I do want to share the experience. I know many of you have been to Auschwitz. I've mentioned it on the podcast before that I went, and some people wrote in, but I know most people haven't, and maybe will never get to go there. But it is extremely powerful. So I want to give you just a little bit of my firsthand experience. We have a lot of pictures from that trip, and I'll kind of explain some of the things, and we'll do that for just a couple of minutes. And then we will tie that into how we can become numb to barbaric realities like the one that we have today, which is the greatest Holocaust of all time by the sheer numbers alone, and that is abortion. So we will cover that. It is a heavy topic. Viewer discretion is advised on a few of the pictures for just children. I would say high schoolers are fine, but beyond that, use your discretion. It's not our language or our banter, which should be the real reason for viewer discretion advised on this podcast. But some of the pictures from Auschwitz and just some of the obvious weightiness of the topic. And so to join me today is my co-host, Mr. Steve Carlin, who joins us from Madison, Wisconsin. Steve, are you drinking moonshine? I see that jar, and it's like, are you familiar with the Toby Keith song, I Love This Bar?
Yeah, great song. Fantastic song.
Great song. And
His
he
kind of
says,
place.
We like to drink our beer from a mason jar, which I had never really heard of. I've heard of people drinking moonshine. They actually, I think, sell moonshines in those jars. Are you drinking alcohol right now? I knew it was a heavy topic. I didn't know I'd push you over the limit.
Yeah, I choose not to answer that question. You can see it's not Toby Keith's beer, and it's not whiskey, but that's as much information as I'm going to divulge right now.
So Buc-ee's, the entity that you love, the famous
Yes.
gas stations, they have like a mom section, which is just like cute. I get my mom's stuff there. I've gotten Mary Lisa's stuff there. It's just like funny things. Anyways, I have not gotten them this coffee cup, although it's very funny. It's a coffee cup and it says, "This may or may not be vodka."
Yeah. That's how we're rolling today on the 40 Days for Life podcast.
Yeah, apparently. This is water for the viewer. This is water.
You're going to know, because by halfway through the podcast, if I'm still lucid and coherent versus this is the 40 Days for Life podcast and you're my best friend, you'll know.
How can you sit there and recount Auschwitz? Well, Steve was drunk. That was part of the thing that aided him.
Yeah.
Or is the famous line out of Christmas Vacation when he asks his dad, how did you manage all our family Christmases? It was so dysfunctional. It was so chaotic. And his dad said, I had a lot of help from Jack Daniels. So, oh my gosh. Okay. Let's just get into this. It seems like there was something else I was going to ask you. Oh, okay. Before we get into Auschwitz, just a beautiful shout out to Poland. I know I've talked about this before. We went back in February. What a great country. What a great country. And they have been so persecuted. Their history is so difficult. They just are fighters. They absolutely love God. They love America. They hate Russia. They made that very clear everywhere we went. And obviously we were there, so the Ukraine-Russian war was still going on. But they were so glad we were there because a lot of people are afraid to go to Poland because of the situation in Ukraine. So they were just delighted that we chose to have our leader conference there. But Steve, you'll be glad. One thing I noticed is that within an hour of being in Poland, I had consumed like 3 sausage links. There were different kinds of sausage. Yeah, it was just unbelievable how people are just giving you sausage. Like, sometimes I guess we give people barbecue sauce and you'll go places and somebody's like, I baked you cookies. They were handing me sausage links. I was like, this is a great country.
It shows the unity of the body of Christ, because you come to Sheboygan and we had brats for breakfast one time, and you go to Poland and you have Polish sausage. This is where we kind of talked about a couple weeks ago. Chicago, like this is where my wife from Chicago and I can find common ground. We can find unity. Is they've got Italian sausage. Here in Wisconsin, we've got Polish sausage and German sausage, which is bratwurst. It really brings the unity that our world needs right now.
It does. And that's a great point. And the pierogies are phenomenal also in Poland. So Poland is very cheap and it's absolutely beautiful. The churches are stunning. The buildings, the architecture. Once they threw out the communists, they were really able to share some of their beauty with the world. So highly recommend going to Poland, and I highly recommend going to Auschwitz. So the overall theme, I think, of my trip, Steve, and you've asked me a lot, and we'll get to the abortion tie-in later. First off, the tour is extremely well done. What a difficult place. One of the first things that I picked up on early on in the tour is the reality of Holocaust deniers. I mean, I know we have like crazy mullahs, people in Iran that are like, there was no Jewish Holocaust. But I just thought there are a bunch of freaks and nobody pays attention to them. Apparently there's a lot. There's just signs and there are certain things said and there's certain displays where they have a sentence like, and this proves once again that what happened here is real, whether the world accepts it or not. There's like these statements where you're like, do they really have to say that? I mean, not that they're selling you on it, but you feel like they're having to justify having the tour almost like, like this actually happened. This isn't a movie. So that was different. And
so
then
Shawn, is that unique to Europe here? Because I don't know if I've ever met a Holocaust denier here in the US. That's okay.
Correct.
It's not just the circles we hang out in. It's just different over there.
And it's generational. So I've learned that through my pro-life trips over there. So the younger kids, like we have people that are like, we didn't land on the moon, man. please do not email me and say we really didn't land on the moon, and don't make fun of that, because I'll only make fun of it. Like that's some big thing. What would be fake landing on the moon? It's like, anyways.
I'd actually like to get those emails. I think that'd be fun
Okay,
banter.
send us an email of why we did not land on the moon and why that's
Shoot your shot.
It's not even like a real, like there's some massive consequence. Okay, we didn't land on the moon. Now what? It's not like Kennedy's still alive. That would be like, okay, now we're meeting somebody who's really nuts. But yeah, I've never understood is like people dedicate their lives to we did not land on the moon. I was told that COVID proved we did not land on the moon. So Steve,
proved. Yeah, step 1, step 2. I don't know. I'm
wasn't
good
Neil
for a good
Armstrong.
COVID rant anytime. I'm always up for
I
a
shouldn't
COVID
even have brought
rant,
that up. I shouldn't even have brought that up. Okay, so it is a generational thing, the Holocaust deniers. It's like the young, trendy thing. And because Auschwitz, I think one of the sobering things is that they have this beautiful, they lay flowers at one of the places where there was a firing squad. And so every year, survivors and family members of survivors come back and they lay flowers. And this last January was the 78th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Isn't that unbelievable? It's 78 years ago. It's nothing. It's nothing. And I think as an American, we always think, and our grandfathers served in World War II. So it's kind of close, but it's way long ago. And they didn't have automatic transmissions, and they didn't have Doritos, and it was a totally different time. Half the Major League Baseball teams didn't exist. It's just a foreign, really bad thing that happened overseas and never happened again. And then going there, you just realize, the buildings are in good shape. They're only 80 years old. It's like brand new in Europe. And it just hits you that this was not long ago at all, which makes the situation in the Middle East very scary.
I think the older I get, the more that becomes apparent. When you first start learning, like I don't know, when's the first time you heard about the Holocaust? For me, I was probably 7 or 8.
Yeah.
And, at that point, when you're 7 or 8 and it's 1990, it feels like it was just ages and ages ago. And the older I get, the more recent it feels. If you think about it, like the time from the end of the Holocaust to the present day, you and I have been alive for more than half of that time. So this is it is very recent history.
Yeah, it's extremely recent. We were born 20 years after the assassination of Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
That's nothing, and to me, the Kennedy assassination is like, oh yeah, that was like 100 years ago, when I was a kid. And I've always loved history, and I've always loved different time periods in history. And I think everyone appreciates, whether it be because of Hollywood or something else, they love this time period of history. So we're definitely going to give you some history, but that was one of the first things I picked up on, is the denier thing is real, and it's just shameful, and you just don't even want to think about it. You're like, anyways,
what's the motive for it? Is there something instructive in the motive for it? Are they trying? Is it because they're anti-Semites? Is it because they're hipsters looking for attention? Like, why would somebody, even more so than why would you deny the moon landing? Like, it takes some real, I don't know what it takes to go and deny the Holocaust. Is there a reason for it that we can learn from?
There's 2 groups of people, and I want the people to actually email in on this. If you know a Holocaust or a Holocaust denier. So the 2 groups that I've gathered, Europeans and Muslims. The Muslims typically, they made it up. They want to get attention and they want to make money. It's an industry. The Holocaust thing is an industry, and to some level it is, because we have to learn about it. There's museums, there's movies, there's documentaries, all of that, but they just use that like they're in it for the money. Jews. Okay, so that's just hating Jews. That's one segment of it. Like, you hate that your enemy's a victim. Okay, and there's probably no greater victim than a Holocaust person who died or a Holocaust survivor. So there's that camp. The other camp is you're 20 years old and this has just been shoved down your throat. Maybe you grew up in Germany, you grew up in Europe, and it was just all Holocaust, 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 never again, never again, never again. And it's over and over, and it's just you're hit over the head with it. And you're like, I mean, did it even really happen? That's the other response that I got. That is similar to landing. That's similar to landing on the moon, I think.
Yeah.
Where you're just like, wait a second, what if I question it? Then I'm kind of different.
We were kind of having this discussion at home just about the whole issue of denying the Holocaust. And my wife said, she's like, I've seen the tattoos. My wife has some good family friends of ours. The mother was a Holocaust survivor, and her daughter came to our house about a month ago before any of this stuff came up, right before any of this stuff came up in the news with Hamas. And as they're about to leave, she said, hey, I don't know if you are willing to, but would you tell our kids just about your mom's experience in the camps and the tattoos and everything? She said, I think it's important for this next generation to carry that memory into the future. You know, we don't have many survivors left anymore. The greatest generation is almost died out. And it's a real wild thing for something which in many ways feels kind of remote. We're now progressive, we're civilized, we've moved beyond that sort of thing. But no, we can have the daughter of a Holocaust survivor walk into our house and tell us about the tattoos that her mother bore the entirety of her life as a result of what took place in Germany and Poland and throughout Europe.
It's awesome. And it is sad that we're losing them. And imagine those Holocaust survivors in Israel when Hamas came in and drug them out. I mean, this is happening again. And this time they were executed. That's a sobering thought for people after 78 years. So I do think that we're not going to make it 20 minutes before the abortion analogy, but people just deny that abortion kills a baby. I mean, Jen Psaki a few weeks ago said, nobody's advocating for abortion up to 40 weeks. We did a whole little series. People can find it on the YouTube channel last month on just the new denial that we have. And that's the difference that's the similarity with the Holocaust survivors, the Holocaust deniers, and the abortion deniers, is that the Holocaust deniers are saying, so they trained these people in. They gathered them up in the ghettos. They put them on trains. They sent them to these different locations called concentration camps where they were systematically gassed, or they were shot by a firing squad and they were surrounded by electric fences, and, 1.2 million of them died in Auschwitz alone. That's what you're telling me. Because if that's true, we are the worst generation in the history of the world. Like, it's so evil that you can't fathom it. And I think that's a legitimate reason to deny the Holocaust. You just can't believe that evil's possible and that we're just irredeemable. And I think people have that with abortion. That you're saying we kill 78 million babies in this violent act? How many? What lake would those bodies fill up? This like sobering thing. So we just deny it. So I do think that's the first similarity to get in there. And that's the first thing I noticed. They have security. You got to go through metal detectors. That was the kind of thing that surprised me. And it's odd. It was odd going into Auschwitz and going through security. It was a very strange sensation because there was high security when it was functional, for sure. Okay. The overall theme of Auschwitz is death. Death happened everywhere. I went with an Irish priest and then Father Paul Felix, the 40 Days for Life chaplain, and Ramona Trevino was on the tour. We had a few of our volunteers, a few of our team members. And, we walk through and you realize all of us came to the conclusion that first off, they're very good, Steve, at leading you through and not talking your ear off. Okay. Nothing is sensationalized. It is. I couldn't thank our tour guide enough. She was amazing. And she was German, but nothing is like, and then this is where the Nazis, there's no changes of tone. They simply say what happened here, and there's silence. There's a lot of silence.
The atrocities speak for themselves.
It speaks for itself. And it made me, the power of silence is so great in our prayer life and when we dialogue with God. And it's so great when there's just nothing to say. And you can reflect. And I was delightfully surprised at how silent the tour was. It's almost like doing Stations of the Cross if you're Catholic. I mean, it's a very difficult, but in many ways beautiful reflection on human life. And I'll get to that part too. But everywhere you go, someone died. And there's just not a lot of places like that. Every room, people were just constantly being shot. Suicide was a massive problem because people would just go and throw themselves on the electric fence.
Viktor Frankl talked about that in Man's Search for Meaning, that you really had to anchor yourself to a purpose. Otherwise, you were going to lose your mind and do that.
Yeah. I think so. And Viktor Frankl, if you have not read that book, it is such a great book. It's such an uplifting book. You have to really sell it as that because people are like, oh my gosh, Holocaust. Man's Search for Meaning is one of the top 5 greatest books of all time that we should all read. It's on our list of everybody should read these 5 books so the world doesn't end. It's on that list. So Man's Search for Meaning. It's not very long either. But I think that what strikes you, so Auschwitz is set up by Heimlich Himmler, and we're going to cover Rudolf. Rudolf Hose is the commander of Auschwitz. And I'll just read one little part from when he is sort of given his orders. We're going to cover him. He is one of 2 repentant Nazis. Not that you're really going to care about that as we get into the details. But Himmler asked him to lead the effort in Auschwitz. It was extremely secretive. They only talked about it in person. He chose Auschwitz, this is a direct quote, on account of its easy access by rail and also because of the extensive site offered so much space for measures that also were isolated. So isolation was very important for this. So Commander Hose, it's spelled Hoss, but in German it's pronounced Hose. He begins basically in the early 1940s, 1941. He starts testing ways to kill people, mass murder, how to kill the most amount of people. So he's kind of going through these scientific experiments because he's going to set up Auschwitz. And that basically led to Auschwitz becoming the most effective killing machine in the history of the world at the time. I think we have a new one now. But at the time, that was it. And he said, basically, this is how they would do it. During standard camp operations, 2 or 3 trains carrying 2,000 prisoners each would arrive daily for 4 to 6 weeks. The prisoners were unloaded in the camp, and then they were subject to a selection. Now, I want to stop here and have Jill put the picture of the exact location where the train stopped. This is there's a lot of powerful points of the tour. This is one of the most powerful points. I think one of the priests had said this was just the kind of the breaking point. You're at the site where the trains stop. Okay, so they're in their nice clothes. They have suitcases. They're obviously fearful, but many of them don't think anything bad is going to happen. It's amazing how naive many of them were. But this is the spot. You see it on the screen of where they actually stop. And they arrive daily. And so the prisoners are unloaded and they go to selection, which was an SS soldier would do the selection. Men were immediately separated from women. Only those deemed suitable for Nazi slave labor would be allowed to live. The elderly, infirm, all children and mothers with children were sent directly to the gas chambers. So that's how the majority of the victims of Auschwitz died, was immediately. And this is the last part of the tour, actually, when you see this spot, because Auschwitz is multiple camps. This is the camp where the train stopped. And by the time, Steve, you go through the first 3/4 of the tour, it's 5 hours long. And about 30 minutes in, you realize this is going to be a really long day. One volunteer was like, you pick your poison. I mean, if you're selected at that moment, you forgo a tremendous amount of suffering. And I think that's one of the reasons they put it as one of the last parts of the tour, because you get off the train, you go over there, you're sitting to the gas chamber. And that was the majority of the people, of the victims. But immediately the elderly and the children, which is just impossible to fathom. So those who were found fit for labor, the survivors, they were marched to barracks, and in one of the camps, stripped naked. They shaved their hair. They were sprayed with disinfectant, and they were given, of course, their tattoo, something that became a staple of Auschwitz. At first, this is interesting, and shows how the devil works. At first, the bunkers, which you see a lot of the bunkers just laid out in that field, those were all covered by the woods. They left it wooded because they didn't want anybody to know what was going on. They wanted it all done in secret to avoid detection. So this system that Commander Rudolf Hose made up worked early on, Steve, and they kind of explained this. So he added 4 more large gas chambers and crematoriums. And that's because you see the final product. So they break down and they say, this was the original Auschwitz, right? Like when you go anywhere and you're like, this is the original house. And then you see how massive it is. But he was giddy about it. He realized how many people they could kill. They had the land. Nobody really figured out what they were doing. The woods were protecting them. It's really in the middle of nowhere. Even to this day, it's kind of a little village, but you're going on a train and you're going in the middle of nowhere. And so he adds these 4 large gas chambers, and that increases the volume. So whenever Steve, he's arrested, and we'll get to his execution later. He is quoted as saying, I can no longer remember the figures. His figure was 1.1 million from memory. And he said, I can no longer remember the figures for smaller actions. Those were non-gas chamber deaths. But they were insignificant by comparison with the numbers of the gas chambers. I regard someone reporting that we had killed 2.5 million. That figure is far too high. Even Auschwitz had limits to its destructive capabilities. So he's claiming the 1.1 million and saying there's no way we could have done 2.5. Even we had our cap. So going back, I know that we've shown you some of these pictures. When I mentioned death being everywhere, there's a section where you just see the gallows. I don't know if you can see the metal bar where people would just be hung. I think after sharing the people are stripped down. So you see the shoes. Many of you, if you've ever gone to Washington, D.C., many times they don't always have them, but they'll have the shoes out. They have to preserve them. So they're not on display all the time. But they are on display all the time in Auschwitz. And you just see the shoes. And it's unbelievable. You see the crutches and the prosthetic limbs from those who had a disability. And of course, immediately they were sent to the gas chambers, and the Nazis kept all of these things. That's why efficiency kept coming up, Steve. Just how effective this was at murdering people, at making money off people, stealing from people, getting rid of people. The only thing, Steve, I could not take a picture of was the hair. That was the most difficult. You see the picture of the shoes in the glass case. It's like this large, you see it. Steve, they had one of those, and it is completely stuffed to the top with hair. And that, to me, was the saddest, most sobering part of Auschwitz, because they shaved their heads. They kept the hair. The reason they kept their hair is they would make certain things out of it to use around the camps. But it's a lot of hair. So that was very, very moving. One strange thing that is surprising as you're going on the tour is how many people escaped. It was a real problem for the Nazis. A lot of people escaped Auschwitz. And apparently, what's hard is the number one reason not to escape is you had family somewhere in there and you didn't want to abandon them. But sadly, some people still escaped. They just left their family. But most didn't. But if you knew your family was dead, if all your relatives were dead, you might as well try to escape. And it was so big. Yeah, nothing to lose. But it was so big that it was possible. And I know we can read testimonies online of people who escaped Auschwitz. But you're in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it's not like there's some big Nazi base, down the street where they're going to pick you up. So if you can get out, you actually have a shot of getting away and surviving. And many people did. So it was kind of, I from memory at those gallows, if they would catch people escaping a lot, and they would just hang them right there on the spot. So the Nazis kept people there by threatening them that if they tried to escape and they were caught, they would kill them. But over time, that didn't really work because they all knew they were going to die anyways. So it was this interesting thing over time where escapes became more common because your family would get killed and you have nothing to lose. Or you're like, well, we're going to die. We know what they're doing here. We might as well try to get out of it. So I was really surprised because when you think Auschwitz, you're like, that's it. It's total lockdown. Nobody can get out. But it was actually fairly common that people would escape. So, okay. Before we get to Maximilian Kolbe's cell, which is definitely a beautiful part of the tour, you see this whole like numbness to death that the Nazis had to have. There's death everywhere, and somehow they're living in these conditions, and they have their barracks, and everybody else has their barracks. But there's just absolute death everywhere. I wanted to point out that, well, let's go on ahead and go to Maximilian Kolbe's cell. So everybody knows the story of Maximilian Kolbe. Hopefully you do, where he trades his life to save a family. He's a Franciscan priest. And this is the cell where he died. It's not open to the public, but we were allowed to go there. Our tour guide said, I'll give you 15 seconds to run over there. And we ran over. I took a couple of photos. In there, you can kind of see the candle, the Easter candle that Pope John Paul II put in there during his visit to Auschwitz. And I think I can hold it up. Remove the glare. So that's his cell, Maximilian Kolbe's cell. And John Paul, JP2, had put a candle in there. And of course, he traded his life for a family. And he was injected with poison, and he died in that cell. And it's a beautiful, beautiful spot and a sign of hope. There is hope all throughout. I know that sounds crazy. it's only 5%, but it's there. It's definitely there. When you see the pictures of the camp, and I know Jill's put it up there, that I guess the most famous one is the gate entering, where work makes freedom is spelled out in German over there. Works makes freedom, which of course is a complete lie. I'll say before we kind of close this part out, Steve, with we'll get into Rudolph, but when you're seeing all this and you're walking around, of course, we're praying the whole time, and it's just very sad. It's extremely sad how they tortured all these people. Look at the bunkers. These beds. It's not a bed. It's a layer of concrete. But you see these bunkers. Those were the women bunkers, the women that they allowed to survive. Because if you were pregnant or you had small kids, you're immediately executed, as we just talked about. But those are the bunkers where the women lived. When you're walking through and you're just seeing how they tortured these people, how they starved them, how they murdered them, there's a new appreciation for General George Patton. And that whole, like, somebody had to go in and just kill all these people. I mean, talk about a just war. It was just absolutely, there's a famous Patton quote. Probably can share it on this podcast episode and not another one. I'll remove the curse words, but he says, gentlemen, we're not going to beat the Germans. We're going to use their guts to clean the chains of our tanks. And it's a very famous quote. He's got a couple of other words in there to spice it up, as you would expect from General Patton. But that attitude had to be it to take out a force like the Nazis, because for them to do this and to be at a lot of times winning the war on different fronts and then having these systems where they're executing all these Jews was just absolutely pure evil. So the last thing that I'll show from the actual camp, or the second to last thing, is the crematorium. This is obviously just it speaks for itself, but those are, there's a room next door where they would enter. I did not take pictures of that. It's where they actually died. The gas would come through these pipes. They were all killed, and then the bodies were shoved in this room where they were obviously burned. And the fires never went out is what we all know now. And so if you look at this system that Rudolf Höss came up with, it's absolutely brutal. There's two things here, Steve. So he's captured, and Himmler tells him to go under disguise, gives him a fake name that sounds like he's like some actor. Because when it all starts going south, Himmler says, well, they're going to come after you. They're going to kill you. And so here's your fake name. Here's your fake ID. But anyways, we catch him. And he goes to Nuremberg, and a psychologist evaluates him. Gustav Gilbert is the American military psychologist who interviewed Commander Höss, and here's what he said. In all of the discussions, he is quite matter-of-fact and apathetic. He shows some belated interest in the enormity of his crime, but gives the impression that it never would have occurred to him if somebody hadn't asked him to do it. There is too much apathy to leave any suggestion of remorse, and even the prospect of hanging does not unduly stress him. One gets the general impression of a man who is intellectually normal, but with a schizoid apathy, insensitivity, and lack of empathy that could hardly be more extreme in a frank psychotic. So, absolute numbness to death. Now, here's what I'll tell you, Steve. He wanted to be a priest. He was raised in an extremely devout Catholic home. His parents said there was a huge emphasis on conscience and sin and repentance and penance for your sins. And he got older, he joined the military, and he became an atheist. And he lost all of his faith in God. So once he's captured and Nuremberg happens, he supposedly has a reversion. So he writes a letter. I'm going to read a small excerpt of his letter because this is the guy that gave us and created Auschwitz.
This is after like the
yeah.
You just talked about the apathy to his deeds that the psychologists.
That's when they captured him, and they're like, "Hey,
so this is later after the fact."
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So they're like, "We're charging you at Nuremberg. I'm doing your psych evaluation. You know, here's the questions. You killed 1 million people," and he just acted like, I mean, it's like the following orders, like totally numb. But then months pass. He's been convicted, and he's on death row. So this is the letter to his wife. Based on my present knowledge, I can see today clearly, severely, and bitterly for me that the entire ideology about the world in which I believe so firmly and unreservedly was based on completely wrong premises and had to absolutely collapse one day. And so my actions in the service of this ideology were completely wrong, even though I faithfully believed the idea was correct. Now it was very logical that strong doubts grew within me, and whether my turning away from my belief in God was based on my turning away from my belief in God was based completely on wrong premises. It has been a hard struggle, but I have again found my faith in God. So then this is the letter to his oldest son. Keep your good heart. Become a person who lets himself be guided primarily by warmth and humanity. Learn to think and judge for yourself responsibly. Don't accept everything without criticism, and is absolutely true. The biggest mistake of my life was that I believed everything faithfully which came from the top, and I didn't dare to have the least bit of doubt about the truth of that which was being presented to me. In all your undertakings, don't just let your mind speak, but listen above all to the voice of your conscience. So this is the spot. We'll put it on the screen. He's convicted at Nuremberg. Then he's handed over to the Polish authorities, who obviously sentence him to death, and they want to kill him. They want to kill him at Auschwitz next to the crematoriums. So that picture I just showed you where the gas chambers were and they burned all the bodies, this is right outside this gallows where the hook is. That's exactly where Commander Rudolf Hose died. So it was, that is actually, Steve, the last thing you see before it's over. And it's so powerful because death catches up to you. Sin catches up to you. You know, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. That's all I could think of saying that. Is he ended up being killed at the very spot where he literally killed 1.1 million people.
I'm not going to say that I take comfort in him being hung or anything like that, but I do think that this whole notion that lies are bound to collapse should be a consolation to all pro-lifers and all people of faith, because we have a lot of deeply unnatural things going on in our world right now, from abortion to the mutilation of children in the name of trans ideology. There's so much wrong in the world right now. And I know oftentimes, particularly some of our leaders and volunteers who live in pro-abortion states or pro-abortion countries, they feel a temptation, at least, to despair. But, you know, I always love that Martin Luther King Jr. quotation where he says the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward truth. And I think you saw that firsthand at that last exhibit at Auschwitz, and these things that are untrue just cannot endure.
Yes, and it's encouraging. And one of the reasons I wanted to read these quotes is because this guy, so if you listen to Hitler's speeches, which I've done too much of in my life, he's nuts. And not just you look back and you're like, wow, you know, but he started off as this charismatic guy. But once he's the Fuhrer, his content is out there. Heimlich Himmler is like that too. So there's a good section of Nazis that you just read them or you talk to them and they're nuts.
They're clear fanatics.
He's not. Rudolph is not, and the guy ran Auschwitz. He's even like reasonable in his conversion. I now see that the whole thing was a lie, you know, and you see like the numbness, like I don't see what the big deal is. And that's the crazy part. Like you're running a camp that's executing Jews and you believe that's a good thing. Well, I believed the lie. He's kind of explaining it away. But he's somebody that if you saw in the supermarket and he wasn't in a Nazi uniform and you talked to him, you wouldn't think this guy's a mass murderer. And we hear that a lot about serial killers and mass murderers. Some of them seem to be serial killers and mass murderers. Some don't. And he's in a category that he really didn't. He grew up in a Catholic home. He had great parents. Everything you read about him is like, it's just kind of spoiled. And that, that whole notion that you're going to cleanse the world of suffering, you're going to improve, the global race through eugenics is extremely scary. It's extremely convincing and can come off as extremely compassionate and from reasonable people who dress well. And of course, that's a direct correlation to what we have today. I mean, think of the niceness and the good manners of so many who support abortion. I think one of the positive things, and we've said this a lot, is post-Roe, we're getting some of the nuts, right? We're getting some of the fanatics where you're like, hey, Northam's on the radio describing infanticide. Is anybody else uncomfortable right now? But still overall, and you have there was a lady, there's a lady recently on TikTok impersonating a dancing baby before she's aborted. It's like, I'm a fetus before an abortion. Woo! And she's dancing. That kind of goofy, psychotic stuff we didn't really have 5 years ago. And it's everywhere now. But what we've always had is what is represented in, I think, Rudolph, which is it's going to be fine. I lost my way, or this is the way. But however, when he's running Auschwitz and when he's sorry for running Auschwitz, he sounds reasonable. And, it takes a psychiatrist to go in there and say, the guy's a psychopath. But I think that's the danger of believing these lies and these ideologies.
That's the sociologist Hannah Arendt who described it as the banality of evil. And it's not unlike that C.S. Lewis quote about how we expect the great evil in the world is done in those layers from a Dickens novel. But really, it's just like men who don't need to raise their voices in well-lit, carpeted office buildings. There's a lot of evil that is not all that dramatic. I think it's easy for us to make Hitler the boogeyman because A, he is, and B, he looked the part. He acted the part. Like he's out there shouting and he's insane and the mustache has to go, all of those sorts of things. Yeah. It's easy to see that, but there's a lot of ordinary people can do extraordinarily evil things. And I'm kind of curious, you shared the quotations from those letters that Rudolf Hose wrote. And obviously, if he found his faith, I'm assuming there's repentance there. But even in those letters, it sounds to me like there's a lot of like, well, I believed the wrong thing. And as a result, the things that I did were wrong. Is there anything where he's, pleading for the mercy of God and the mercy of those who he wronged? Or is he just kind of cool and calculated about his reconversion as well?
It could be that. One of the problems with him is he didn't speak English. So I think it's also a translation thing, because even when you read the quotes, you realize they're really wordy, and Germans aren't typically very wordy, but the English translation's trying to kind of draw it out. I guess when he's saying it was a hard struggle, but I have again found my faith in my God. I'd be interested to hear what that, like, have a German translator maybe clean that up. But what is, I guess, encouraging, because we don't want anybody in hell, is that he connects it to his loss of faith. He connects Auschwitz to abandoning God. But yeah, there's no like falling on the floor, sinner in the hands of an angry God. Again, he's writing to his family, so I think there's probably a little bit of saving face. And I think when people hear of repentant Nazis, good for them. I don't really care. And I understand that. I understand that. When you walk around Auschwitz and then you kind of hear, he kind of repented right before he died. It's like, All right, good for him. So I know that's a different kind of scenario. We want everybody to repent. It's not as strong as Hans Frank. Hans Frank's the other repentant Nazi, and we've talked about him. He hung at Nuremberg on October 16th of 1946, and his quote is what opens the defining book on Nazi Germany, which is The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. If you are any kind of a history buff and you have somehow not read that book, get that. That is the defining classic by William Shearer. Great book. I think it's 175,000 pages or something. It's like this. It is long, but it doesn't feel that way. It goes quickly and or as quick as you can. But the opening quote of that book is from Hans Frank, and he is about to hang at Nuremberg, and he says, 1,000 years would have passed, and the guilt of Germany will not have been wiped away. So those were his last words, and he was another fallen away Catholic who came back to his faith. So that is what I didn't want to talk about him and not mention the conversion part, because supposedly it happened. And then him writing his kids is kind of what we have. But I think, Steve, overall, the trip made me realize that abortion's totally possible. We get this question all the time. I know the abortion workers get it. How could you do this? How could you do that? And it helped me understand abortion more. It helps me understand them being a little bit more out with abortion. Like, we don't want disabled kids. I think we went through a period from 1973 to 2020 or 2019, really, where it was safe, legal, and rare, and reproductive rights, and you kind of got a save face, right, if you're pro-abortion. And I think that's gone. I mean, now Iceland openly brags about how they don't have Down syndrome because they killed them all through abortion, and just the Nazis kind of owning it. Of course, they started it off in secret with Auschwitz, but then, they built their case of why the Jews needed to go and how the Jews were the problem. And they did that all throughout the 1930s. And that has reared its ugly head now, where that's somehow acceptable to hate Jews or to side with those who are killing Jews because they're Jews.
The woke have rediscovered the virtue of free speech suddenly when it comes to killing Jews. Actually, we shouldn't have cancel culture.
Look, this is a dicey area here, Steve. So I'll be careful. I know it's like you can't just run around and call people Nazis. But when you look at a lot of the language of the Third Reich and a lot of the language that Heimlich Himmler used and all this stuff, it's really woke. A lot at Auschwitz and just throughout reading history of the Holocaust, there's a lot of wokeness. There's a lot of the benefits of sterilization. Definitely the isolation. You are not with us. You are against Germany. You hate the Fuhrer. You hate Germany. You're a communist. Just all the isms come out and you get shamed. And I'm reading if you want a beautiful book, it's so good. I'm halfway through it, but I'm happy to share. I'm happy to recommend it to everybody. It's called The Good Germans, and it's recent. I think it's 2022 copyright. It's not old. The Good Germans. And it doesn't do like 100,000 Germans that spoke out against Hitler. You only follow like 6. So you get to know these people that you've never heard of. It's an excellent book by a British author, The Good Germans, and very uplifting too. And I think it's telling in our time in 2023, because we will be asked those questions by kids and grandkids. Did you not speak? Did you not do more? Did you not speak out? Like they were slaughtering babies? And that's why the overturning Roe is so significant, because it's that point in history. Why did they do that? Was it good? Was it bad? And you get into abortion with future generations, either in an academic setting or a family setting. And there were good Germans, and some did speak out. Many didn't, but some did. Okay, Steve, why don't we reference some other uplifting podcasts for people? Because we've done podcasts on why we do this, why man commits these atrocities. And so that is season 8, episode 8. I believe the title is Cheer Up, It's Lent. So that was our Lenten podcast.
We dig into all these evils. There's something fundamentally wrong, and that's something that everybody agrees. They may disagree with what it is, but everyone in our society right now, at least, is united in the notion that something is wrong in the heart of man.
Exactly. And obviously, for all of you listening audio only, I strongly encourage you to go back and watch the video of some of the pictures that that we put up. And I know you can get pictures of Auschwitz everywhere, but there's something about just a firsthand experience. Okay, the other podcast, there's a couple of podcasts we want to reference, and we'll put these in the show notes. Why is abortion genocide? That's podcast number 149. Should we say that it's a genocide? So we use the word Holocaust. Is that insensitive to Jews? Should we ever bring up the Holocaust when discussing abortion? And I think this was a topic more so 20 years ago than it is now, frankly. When it comes to this, there's slavery and there's the Jewish Holocaust. My rule, Steve, is on certain topics, we don't get to pick our analogies because there's just so few. Okay. So they're obviously different, the Holocaust and abortion, but it's an appropriate analogy because Nazi law dehumanized Jews so that they could be killed. It's an appropriate analogy because Dred Scott dehumanized blacks so they could be enslaved. And it's a perfect analogy because Roe v. Wade dehumanized the unborn so that we could have legal abortion. We weren't aborting people legally in 1972. Okay. We weren't aborting people legally in 1864. It was Roe v. Wade because we recognized that the unborn were people. So when we stopped doing that, we could kill them. So I just think it's not this ridiculous, absurd, out of touch analogy because there's only so many things and so many genocides and injustices you can compare things to wake up a current generation. And so I think it's people have asked me this with slavery, and I say it's not that it's the best analogy, it's that it's the only appropriate one to use because we've only dehumanized Americans twice in our country, and these are the 2 times, abortion and slavery. So okay, so that's episode number 149, why abortion is genocide. And then the recipe for genocide is podcast season 5, episode 30. Season 5, episode 30. And then we have another podcast, 4 lessons from a successful genocide. And that is on the Armenians and how they were wiped away and certainly motivated Hitler.
Which is happening again, by the way. Have you seen that in the news?
Yes, I have. And without the Kardashians, we wouldn't know anything about Armenians. I mean, that's what Hitler said. After all, who remembers the Armenians? You know, when somebody warned him about executing all the Jews, said there'll be maybe a real ruckus, but after all, who remembers the Armenians? So that's 4 lessons from a successful genocide. That's podcast 6, episode 32. Podcast 6, episode 32. Okay, Steve, any thoughts?
Well, I think something that's worthwhile talking about, you mentioned we don't get to pick our analogies, and we do get that question, is it appropriate to bring this up? There's kind of that line that, the first person that brings up Hitler loses the argument.
Yeah.
So we want to be careful. We don't want to use the Holocaust or any other genocide for shock value. And we also, I think, have to be careful about that sort of temptation where it's like, the Holocaust only killed 14 million people. Abortion is already at like 60, 70 million, just in the United States. Like
my genocide can beat up your genocide.
Those things are not helpful, but we can just speak objectively about things. The loss of life, I think what really draws them together is that it's industrialized. We've got there's a great comic, I think it's called like Existential Comics or something like that, and the first frame is this guy saying, and then we had the Age of Enlightenment where we threw out the superstition of religion. And then the second frame, the guy says, oh, what happened then? And then the third frame is the guy said, well, mostly genocide. And that's what is the story of the last 100 years, or maybe a little more than 100 years. we have to be aware that technology and just the principles of, I guess, management have created the possibility where you no longer need to go into a field of battle and mow people down with swords. We have turned this into a business, into an industry. It can be done in some ways, not cleanly. There's never blood that's shed cleanly, but just as they hid away the atrocities in Auschwitz with trees and a forest surrounding them, Planned Parenthood does the same thing. We have been into former abortion facilities, but we're not able to go and walk into the Planned Parenthood where we live and go in and see the horrors. We have to rely on the survivor accounts of the women who've had the abortions, who have walked out and tell us the stories of what it was like in that waiting room, what it was like in the recovery room where they're handed the cracker and the cup of juice and left to fend for themselves. This is the world that we continue to live in. And as much as we'd like to pretend that we're progressive now and we have moved beyond barbarity, Nazism, I'll say it, Nazism was a progressive ideology. It's characterized as far right, and in some ways that's correct. But eugenics, these goals of engineering a perfect society without suffering or any problems, that is a fundamentally progressive trait. And the same instincts in man's worst nature are alive and well today, unfortunately.
They are, and it shows what we're capable of. And I will add on the Nazi ideology and slavery, and this is similar to abortion. It's not that they're kind of tolerated or excused, but that they're seen as a good. There's a positive light put on it. And how has the exploitation of rape victims led to so many good people supporting abortion? Something I've really been thinking about. I mean, how does, the Jews are taking all your jobs. And once they're gone, you're going to get your job back. How many of these manipulative, emotional things did people buy the lie and support or not say anything when they knew something was going on? And abortion is sold as healthcare, right? I mean, and it's killing a baby. So
it's a lie. And there are so many lies in our world right now. Like, we're all used to being lied to. We're lied to by the media. We're lied to by the government. We're lied to by politicians from both parties. Everybody is lying right now. But the most pernicious lies, I think, the most dangerous lies are the lies that we tell to ourselves. Yes, Himmler and Hitler lied to Rudolf Hose, but at a certain point, he had to lie to himself in order to get to the point that he got. And I think we see the same thing. I mean, so often if we're out there doing sidewalk outreach in front of a Planned Parenthood, we can see the anguish on the woman as she knows in her heart that abortion is not the right thing to do, but she's lying to herself. And that's why she got in the car and she drove out to Planned Parenthood. And I'm not condemning her for that. I have great sympathy for all of the people who somehow find themselves in that position where they're making that decision. But the workers, the women getting abortions, everybody involved, the politicians, we have to lie to ourselves. And that's very dangerous, because it's one thing to say, like, we can't judge. We're not supposed to judge. The Lord tells us not to judge the hearts of others. Only God knows our hearts. And sometimes that's true of ourselves. Sometimes we don't know our own hearts and we are compromised in our own consciences. And if you lie to yourself, it's not going to turn out well. A lot of bad things can happen at that point because you've lost that natural check, the reason that leads you to do right rather than to do violence, including violence that can take lives by the millions or the tens of millions.
And there's the reason it's a bad analogy to take that angle is it's totally different of the Nazis. Are they the abortion workers? And of course they're not. The way that the Jews were tortured, it's much different than how an abortion is done, which is very quick and very violent. Whereas many of the Jews endured all of this suffering and then they were killed. It's obviously different. Same with slavery, very different. Where it's the same is the philosophy, the dehumanization, that if you dehumanize somebody, you can own them or you can kill them. You can do whatever you want. And that is so consistent. And that is the perfect analogy. And you can say whatever you want about Nazis. They didn't break one German law in everything that they did. And they pointed that out at Nuremberg time and time again. Fortunately, no one cared because they committed global war crimes. But here, and we can wrap up after this, Steve, here's where the Holocaust is different and what's not different with our modern day crisis of abortion. It was not different with slavery. Most of the Nazis, you made the comment, they did make their decision after they were ordered to participate in it. All true. But that was a top-down operation. Okay? The Holocaust. From Hitler down, this is what we're doing. Build the camps, soldiers execute, everybody's doing it. I was following orders. We don't have that. We wanted slavery. The plantation owners wanted slavery. They weren't taken off to court and be like, well, I was told by my general. No. Abortion doctors want to be abortion doctors. They do it for money. Many Planned Parenthood executives like their jobs. They want their jobs. There's at the lower levels of the abortion industry, and you hear Abby and others talk about that, there's a little bit of following orders. But for the majority of it, as an industry, it's wanted and it's profitable. Okay. And that's the difference. Slavery was extremely profitable, and abortion is extremely profitable. And the people doing it at the highest levels and the mid-tier levels want to do it. They're not being sort of coerced or manipulated in any kind of way. And that is why we have more conversions. That's why we have so many workers leave, because they think it's good. They pursue it. They get it. And they think they're saving the world. And then maybe they see an abortion, or they, read a medical textbook or whatever it is, and it stirs their heart and they convert. And it's because they're a little bit more free to do so. So it's very interesting. Okay. Anything else, Steve?
I think that's about all I've got. We've covered a lot of ground. It's been a heavy hour here.
Yes, it has been. And we appreciate everybody with your comments. Please email us at podcast@40daysforlife.com, podcast@40daysforlife.com. Let me know if you've been to Auschwitz, and let me know your most kind of powerful part of it. I know I mentioned a couple of mine, but we'd love to hear that. And again, this is such a good warning. If we ignore history, we're bound to repeat it, and we are repeating it. And I hate this sentiment that we are seeing, which is anti-God, this hatred of Christians, this hatred of Catholics, this hatred of Jews, this hatred of religion is very dangerous. And now we have white progressives aligning themselves with Islamic terrorists, and it's an unbelievable alliance. And it's just unbelievable. So be sure to rate, review, and share this podcast. Thank you, Steve, and we will see you next time. God bless you.